The wind did not arrive all at once. It crept, it whispered through fence gaps, sifted grit across the hard ground, and made the horses uneasy days before the sky finally turned the color of old tin. People would later swear the storm came out of nowhere, but those who were paying attention knew something was wrong long before the first snow fell. They just didn't think she had anything to do with surviving it. When the mail-order bride stepped down from the wagon that autumn, boots sinking into mud before she could even straighten her skirt, the settlement decided what she was worth in a single glance. Too small, too quiet, too thin for frontier work. She stood there holding a single trunk, wrapped in a coat already mended twice, blinking against the dust as if the land itself offended her eyes. Her name was Clara Henson, though most people didn't bother to learn it. To them, she was simply the bride, the one who'd answered an ad placed by a man who died of a fever 2 weeks before she arrived. No husband, no claim cabin, no family waiting, just land the town council didn't know what to do with, and a woman they assumed would either leave or break before winter. They gave her a narrow strip of ground near the low bend, where runoff pooled after rains, the worst lot in the settlement. Someone laughed and said it suited her, soft ground for a soft woman. Another said she wouldn't last a month once the cold came. A third suggested she sell herself a ticket back east before the trains stopped running. Clara said nothing. She nodded once, thanked them, and dragged her trunk across the mud alone. What she built there was not a cabin, not by their standards. No squared logs, no proper corners, no raised floor. She dug into the earth with borrowed tools, her hands blistering raw, her breath turning white in the mornings. She mixed soil with straw and water, packing it by hand, shaping walls that curved instead of meeting cleanly. When the structure began to rise, it looked wrong to the men who passed by. Too low, too rounded, too much like something meant to sink back into the land instead of standing proud against it. They called it a mud shack. They said it looked like something a child would make if you gave them dirt and told them to pretend at building a house. They said it would melt in the first hard rain, collapse under snow, rot from the inside out. One man spat near her doorway and said she might as well dig her own grave while she was at it. Clara kept working. She lined the walls thicker on the north side, though no one noticed. She angled the entrance away from the prevailing winds, though no one cared. She packed the floor down until it was hard as stone, then layered it with packed clay and ash. She built low shelves into the walls, sealed tight, and stored what little food she had inside them. She scavenged broken boards, old canvas, anything that could be used to slow air, to trap warmth. The men laughed hardest when she refused help with a proper stove. "Ain't no chimney," they said. "Smoke'll choke you dead." She nodded, thanked them, and kept her fire low, venting it through a narrow flue she sealed by hand every night. By November, the wind sharpened, the ground froze, the sky lost its color. That was when people started paying attention to her again, only to shake their heads harder. Snow came early that year, light at first, pretty enough to make children run outside laughing. But Clara watched how it drifted, how it piled against buildings, how it scoured some walls bare and buried others whole. She reinforced the south side of her shack with packed earth, smoothing it so the wind would slide instead of catch. She buried the lower half of her walls deliberately, shoveling snow up and tamping it down until it froze solid. Someone saw her doing it and laughed loud enough for the whole street to hear. "She's helping winter kill her," they said, burying herself alive. The storm warnings never came. In 1887, no one rang bells or sent telegrams west fast enough to matter. The sky simply dropped. Snow fell so thick it erased distance. Wind howled hard enough to shake the ground. By the third day, cabins disappeared halfway up their walls. By the fourth, roofs vanished. By the fifth, doors could not be opened. Livestock died where they stood. People lit fires and watched their wood vanish faster than fear. Chimneys clogged with ice. Walls cracked. Drafts found their way into every proud, squared corner the town had once bragged about. And Clara Henson sat inside her mud shack, listening to the storm slide over her roof instead of tearing at it. The heat held, not warm, never comfortable, but survivable. Her breath no longer froze in front of her face. The walls stayed dry. The floor did not leach cold into her bones. The storm piled itself around her home like a blanket instead of a weapon. She didn't know yet that the settlement was disappearing. By the time the blizzard reached its worst, no one could see more than a few feet beyond their own doors, if they could reach the doors at all. Snow sealed windows from the outside. Roofs sagged under weight they were never meant to bear. Families huddled together in rooms growing colder by the hour, burning furniture, then books, then hope. And still no one thought of the mud shack. When the wind finally began to ease, It did not reveal a town buried neatly in white. It revealed shapes wrong where buildings had been, drifts taller than houses, silence where animals had been, smoke gone from chimneys that would never draw again. The first man who dug his way free expected to find bodies. What he found instead was a low, rounded shape half buried near the bend, intact, unbroken, its doorway still clear. Smoke rose from it. That was when the joke stopped. At the beginning of the storm, they had mocked the mail-order bride's mud shack. By the end of it, they would be knocking on her door. The first knock came weak, almost apologetic, as if the wind itself were testing her door. Clara had been awake for hours, though she no longer knew how many days the storm had raged. Time had narrowed to simple things: the fire's breath, the tightness in her fingers, the sound of snow sliding instead of striking. When the knock came again, harder this time, she did not jump. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. No one knocked on doors in a blizzard unless they were desperate. She unsealed the flue, let the smoke thin, and eased the door inward just enough to look out. The drift beyond had hardened into a wall. A man stood half buried in it, face raw and red, beard stiff with ice. She recognized him immediately, though he looked smaller now, folded in on himself. Thomas Rigg, one of the loudest voices when the laughter had started. "Please," he said, the words scraping out of him. I didn't know where else to go." She opened the door wider. Cold tried to rush in, but the shape of the entry slowed it, bled it away. Thomas staggered forward and dropped to his knees just inside, breathing hard, his hands shaking violently. Clara closed the door behind him, resealed the cracks with practiced motions, and crouched beside him without speaking. He looked around, eyes unfocused at first, then widening. It wasn't warmth that shocked him, it was stillness. No howling through the walls, no sharp drafts cutting at his ankles. The fire burned low but steady, its heat lingering instead of vanishing. The walls were dry, the ceiling unbroken. You're alive," he said finally, as if he'd only just realized she was more than a rumor. "Yes," Clara said. He laughed once, a short broken sound that turned into something else before it finished. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed until his shoulders shook. She waited. When it passed, she handed him a cup of warmed water, then sat back on her heels. "How many?" she asked. He swallowed. "I don't know. My wife. We burned the last of the chairs last night. The door froze shut. I dug out when the wind dropped this morning." His eyes flicked toward the walls again. "I saw your roof first. Thought I was seeing things." By nightfall, there were 5 of them. Clara rationed space like food. People sat shoulder to shoulder along the curved walls, knees drawn up, breaths shallow. She taught them how to move slowly, how to keep the air from churning too much. She showed them how to pack snow against the outside of the door again once it was closed, how to seal it so it held heat instead of stealing it. No one mocked her then. Another knock came after dark, then another. Word moved through the wreckage of the settlement without voices, carried by instinct, by the simple truth that smoke still rose from the mud shack while nothing else breathed. Some arrived with frostbitten fingers wrapped in rags. Some were half blind from snow glare. One woman was carried in on a door torn from its hinges, her feet already blackened, her face grey and tight with pain she refused to name. Clara made room anyway. She showed them where to sit, how to lean against the walls so the earth could draw the worst of the cold from their backs, how to take turns feeding the fire just enough to keep it alive without wasting fuel. She split dried roots and scraps she had saved, portions small but steady. "You planned for this?" someone whispered at one point, awe creeping into their voice. Clara did not answer. She remembered the laughter too clearly to feel any satisfaction in their silence now. Outside, the settlement did not recover. When the wind returned, it found little left to destroy. Roofs collapsed inward under their own weight. Chimneys toppled, choking fires. Snow filled rooms like water fills a sinking ship. Inside the shack, the air grew close. People coughed softly. Fear pressed against the walls harder than the storm ever had. Clara cracked the vent when she could, resealing it before heat bled away. She slept in minutes-long stretches, waking at every shift in sound. On the 3rd night after Thomas arrived, someone began to scream from outside. The sound cut through the walls sharply, close enough to feel. A man's voice, hoarse and panicked, shouting names that never answered. The screams went on long enough that several people inside began to cry. Clara stood. "Stay," someone said, grabbing her sleeve. "You can't." She shrugged free and took a shovel from the wall. The door opened against the packed drift. Snow pushed in, but the shape of the entry slowed it again, robbed it of force. Clara followed the sound, digging by feel, by memory of where houses had once stood. Her fingers burned. Her breath tore at her lungs. She found him collapsed against what had been his porch, arms wrapped around nothing. It took 2 trips to get him back. By the time they dragged him inside, He was barely conscious. Clara stripped the ice from his clothes, layered him between bodies, pressed warm hands against his chest until his breathing steadied. No one spoke. They stayed that way through the night, pressed together, listening to the wind pass overhead like something hunting and failing to find them. When morning came, if it could be called morning at all, the storm had broken its own teeth. The sky lightened, not blue, but pale enough to see by. Snow lay higher than fences, higher than window frames. The town was gone beneath it. People emerged slowly, blinking, stunned by the scale of what they saw. Cabins crushed flat, barns split open, paths erased. The mud shack stood half buried, rounded roof intact. Walls thick and unbroken, snow banked deliberately against it like a fortification. Someone laughed then, not mockery, but disbelief. "That thing outlasted us all," they said. Clara stepped outside last, boots crunching against a surface that had once been street. She looked at the wreckage with a distant expression, as if she'd already mourned it in her head weeks ago. Behind her, people gathered, wrapped in borrowed blankets, eyes following her every movement now. "What do we do?" someone asked. She looked at the sky, at the drifts, at the way the land had changed shape under winter's hand. "We dig," she said, "and we don't build the same way again." No one argued. The blizzard of 1887 had buried the settlement. What emerged afterward would not look the same, and the mud shack, once laughed at, once dismissed, had become the center of it all. Digging began with hands that no longer trusted the ground beneath them. The first shovel strike echoed wrong, too hollow, too close to collapse. Men froze mid-swing, afraid the earth would give way beneath their boots. Snow had packed itself into layers like stone, hiding voids where roofs had fallen in, where walls leaned at impossible angles. Every step carried the chance of dropping into something that could not be climbed out of. Clara set the rhythm. She did not raise her voice. She did not give speeches. She simply chose a spot where the drift sloped unnaturally and began to dig, slow and deliberate, carving instead of hacking. Others watched for a moment, then joined without being asked. They uncovered the schoolhouse first, or what remained of it. The roof had collapsed inward early in the storm, crushing desks and blackboards into splintered piles. 2 bodies were found near the back wall, huddled together beneath a coat that had not been enough. The digging stopped while they were carried out, then resumed without ceremony. There was too much ground left to clear for grief to linger. Food became the next problem. What little had survived in above-ground pantries was soaked or frozen solid. Flour had turned to paste, meat cracked when struck. Livestock that had not died outright had wandered into drifts and vanished. Hunger arrived quickly, sharp and impatient, bringing tension with it. Again, the mud shack mattered. Clara opened the sealed shelves built into her walls and took inventory quietly. Dried roots, a sack of beans, hard bread wrapped in cloth and clay-lined containers. Enough to stretch if portions stayed small and regular. She shared it without comment, setting aside rations before anyone could ask. "This won't last," Thomas said one night, staring into the low fire. "No," Clara replied. "It will last long enough. Enough time to dig out what had been buried deliberately." They followed her to the edge of the settlement, where the land dipped just enough to trap snow. Beneath a drift taller than a man, Clara uncovered a shallow pit she had sealed before winter, marked only by a stone she could identify by touch. Inside were jars packed tight, lined with ash, buried below the frost line. Someone let out a low sound that might have been a prayer. "You hid this?" a woman asked. "I stored it," Clara said, same as anyone should. The words landed differently now than they would have months earlier. As days passed, people began sleeping in shifts inside the mud shack, not because there was nowhere else, but because it felt wrong to spread out yet. The other structures were unstable, bitterly cold, reminders of mistakes made. Inside the rounded walls, the air stayed calmer, warmer, safe. And then came the arguing. It started small, about who should get the first rebuilt cabin, who had lost more, whose land should be cleared first. Hunger sharpened every edge. Fear lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for a crack to push through. One evening, a man named Harold Price stood and pointed at Clara across the room. "This isn't right," he said. "She planned this. She knew something we didn't." The room went still. Clara met his gaze without blinking. "You saying she caused it?" someone snapped. "I'm saying she benefited from it," Harold replied. "Her shack survived. Ours didn't. Now we're all eating her food, sleeping in her walls." A murmur rose. Not agreement, uncertainty. Clara stood slowly. "I didn't make the storm," she said. Her voice was steady but not loud. "I built for it," Harold scoffed. "You expect us to believe that?" She walked to the wall and pressed her palm flat against the packed earth. "I expect you to remember laughing," she said. "I expect you to remember telling me to leave before winter. I expect you to remember refusing to help because what I built offended your idea of a proper house." Silence stretched. "I didn't ask you to trust me," she continued. "I just didn't build to impress you." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Thomas stood. "She's right," he said quietly. "We built tall and proud and thin. She built low and thick and ugly, and we're alive because of it. Harold opened his mouth again, then closed it. He sat down heavily, staring at the floor. The argument did not return. Instead, something else replaced it. Attention. People began watching how Clara moved through the space, how she sealed cracks before they became drafts, how she layered earth where walls met roof, how she angled entrances and built windbreaks from packed snow and debris. When the first attempt at rebuilding began, it did not look like the settlement that had existed before. Cabins were dug partially into slopes, walls were thickened with earth and straw, corners softened, roofs lowered. People complained less about appearances and more about whether a wall would hold heat. The mud shack became a blueprint. One afternoon, while digging out the remains of the general store, they found a body frozen upright near the door, hands still clenched around the handle. The sight rattled everyone. It could have been any of them. That night, Clara sat alone for the first time since the storm, fire burning low, listening to the settlement breathe outside her walls again. She thought of the man who had sent for her with a letter she still carried, folded thin with use, a stranger she had traveled weeks to meet, only to arrive too late. She wondered what he would have thought of the home she built in his absence. She did not romanticize it. There was no comfort in imagining approval. What mattered was that she had survived. The blizzard of 1887 became something people spoke of carefully, as if naming it too loudly might call it back. They told stories of snow burying houses whole, of screams swallowed by wind, of the day the mud shack became a refuge instead of a joke. But they did not yet understand the cost fully. Spring would reveal what winter had truly taken and what it had changed forever. And when it did, the settlement would face a choice far harder than enduring cold. Spring did not arrive gently. It came in fits. One day a weak sun that softened the snow just enough to make walking dangerous. The next a hard freeze that turned everything brittle again. The ground heaved and cracked, as if waking from a long illness. Water pooled where nothing had pooled before. The land no longer behaved the way people remembered. That was when the dead began to surface. Not dramatically, not all at once. A hand exposed by melt near the old livery. A roof beam shifting to reveal what lay beneath it. Each discovery slowed the work, bent backs a little further, made the silence heavier. The settlement counted losses carefully, too carefully. Numbers were easier than names. Clara avoided those tallies. She focused on what could still be done, where to dig drainage so meltwater wouldn't flood new shelters, how to reinforce earth walls before thaw weakened them, how to keep the fires low enough not to rot the packed clay from the inside. People listened now. Even those who had once laughed found themselves waiting for her nod before making changes. That, more than the storm, unsettled her. Power shifts quietly on the frontier. One day you are invisible, the next your absence would be noticed. Clara felt eyes on her when she crossed open ground. So felt conversations stall when she approached. Gratitude carried weight, and weight turned into expectation faster than she liked. It became clear when the council called a meeting. They gathered in the only structure large enough to hold them, an earth-reinforced storehouse half dug into the slope, its walls still damp from melt. Clara stood near the back, arms folded, already wishing she had not come. "We need to decide how we rebuild," one of the councilmen said. His voice echoed wrong in the space, bouncing instead of settling. "We can't risk another winter like the last." A murmur of agreement followed. "We need standards," another added. "Guidelines, something different." Eyes shifted toward Clara without anyone turning their heads fully. She felt it like pressure on her spine. "Say it," she said. The first man cleared his throat. "We were thinking, maybe you should advise." Clara's jaw tightened. "Advise what? Construction? Layout? Storage?" He gestured vaguely. "You clearly know what works." "What I know," Clara said, "is what I built, with the time and tools I had, on land you didn't want." Silence fell hard. "You want rules," she continued, stepping forward now, "because rules make it easier to blame someone next time. You want me to tell you how to build, so if it fails, you can say you followed instructions." "That's not fair," someone muttered. "No," Clara agreed. "It's honest." The councilman shifted. "Then what do you suggest?" She looked around the room, at the tired faces, the bandaged hands, the quiet fear still sitting behind people's eyes. "I suggest you stop pretending this place can be what it was," she said. "The land's changed. The weather's changed. You either adapt to that, or you rebuild pretty houses that freeze again." A long pause. Finally, Thomas spoke from the side. "She's not asking to lead." He looked at Clara. "She's asking us to learn." That settled it more than any vote. The settlement rebuilt slowly, deliberately. Fewer structures, thicker walls, shared storage dug deep and lined carefully, paths cut low between buildings so wind couldn't race through unchecked. The idea of individual pride gave way to collective survival, though not without friction. Not everyone accepted it. Harold Price began building his new cabin higher than recommended, insisting he'd lost enough already unsteady and wouldn't live half-buried like an animal. Others warned him. Clara did not. When his walls cracked during a late cold snap, it was Thomas who helped him reinforce them with earth and straw in silence. Harold never apologized. He didn't need to. He rebuilt differently after that. As spring edged towards summer, something else surfaced alongside the dead and the debris, stories. People began asking Clara where she'd learned to build that way, who taught her, what place she came from. She answered simply, "My father dug our cellar deeper every year," she said once. Said cold always wins if you give it edges to grab. That was all. No grand lineage, no hidden schooling, just a habit of watching what failed and refusing to repeat it. The mud shack remained standing through it all, even as newer structures rose around it. Some suggested dismantling it, using the materials elsewhere. Clara refused. "It stays," she said. "It's part of the ground now." Late one evening, after the worst of the melt had passed, she found herself sitting alone outside it, watching steam rise faintly from the earth as warmth met cold beneath the surface. The settlement lay quiet behind her, not sleeping yet, but resting. She thought then, not for the first time, about leaving. There were trains east, places where her name would mean nothing again, where no one would look at her as if she were an answer instead of a person. The thought tempted her more than she expected. It was Thomas who interrupted it. "They're talking about you again," he said, sitting beside her without invitation. She sighed. "Let me guess. They want to name something." He smiled faintly. "Something like that?" She shook her head. "I didn't come here to be remembered." "I know," he said. "But you were." They sat in silence for a while, and listening to the night insects test the air as if unsure it was safe. "What happens next?" Thomas asked. Clara looked out across the rebuilt shelters, their low shapes blending into the land instead of fighting it. "Next," she said, "is the part where people forget why they changed." He frowned. "You think they will?" "Eventually," she said. "That's human." The wind shifted then, not cold this time, just strong enough to move grass, to remind them the land was never finished teaching. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Next winter will decide if they learned enough," she said. And though the sky was clear that night, no one laughed anymore. The first snow of the next winter did not scare anyone. That was the problem. It fell light and clean, dusting roofs without sound, settling into the shallow paths the settlement had cut between buildings. Children stepped into it laughing, boots leaving neat impressions instead of vanishing into drifts. Smoke rose from chimneys that had been shortened and widened, drawing steady instead of fast. Doors opened and closed without sticking. People nodded to one another with quiet satisfaction. They had learned, or at least they believed they had. Clara watched from the doorway of the mud shack as the flakes came down, her breath slow, her hands wrapped around a warm cup she hadn't bothered to sweeten. The air smelled different this year, drier, sharper. The wind carried less warning. It worried her in a way she couldn't explain without sounding like superstition. She said nothing. Experience had taught her that warnings were most often dismissed when they arrived without spectacle. As winter deepened, the settlement held. Walls stayed warm longer, fires burned slower, shared stores remained dry and accessible. When storms came, snow piled where it was meant to and slid where it wasn't. No one froze in their sleep. No one woke to ice creeping across their blankets. Confidence returned quietly, and with it, impatience. "We can expand," someone suggested during a meeting. "More land, more buildings." "We don't need to bury everything," another added. "That was for the big one." Clara felt the shift before it fully took shape. She saw thinner walls go up at the edge of town, saw storage raised off the ground again for convenience, heard laughter return, not cruel, not loud, but careless. Winter punishes carelessness more efficiently than cruelty. The real test came late, when the sky closed in without warning and the wind turned sharp in the span of a single afternoon. It wasn't the blizzard of '87. It didn't need to be. It was colder than expected, faster than planned for, and it lasted just long enough to find the weak points. One roof tore loose at the edge of the settlement. A wall cracked where someone had shaved it too thin to save time. Smoke backed up in a poorly angled chimney and filled a room before anyone noticed. No one died, but several came close. That night, Clara woke to a knock. Not frantic, not desperate, just firm. She opened the door to find Harold Price standing there, hat in his hands, shoulders hunched against the cold. His beard had gone grey in patches since the storm 2 years earlier. He looked older than he should have. "I should have listened sooner," he said. She waited. "My place. It held, mostly," he continued, "but not the way yours did." Clara nodded once. "Mostly isn't enough in winter," he swallowed. "I won't make the same mistake again." "I know," she said. He looked at her, really looked at her this time. Why didn't you leave? The question surprised her. She considered it carefully before answering. Because I built something that worked, she said, and I wanted to see if others would learn from it. He nodded, a small, heavy movement. We did, some of us slower than others. When he left, Clara resealed the door and sat by the fire until dawn, listening to the settlement breathe through the cold. Spring came clean that year. Snow melted without panic. Water drained where it was meant to. The ground held. People emerged thinner, quieter, but intact. They repaired what had cracked and reinforced what had nearly failed without argument. No one suggested returning to the old ways. The mud shack remained where it always had, half-buried, rounded, unimpressive to the eye, and invaluable to the memory of the place. New buildings surrounded it now, but none overshadowed it. Children played along its packed walls. People leaned against it when talking, as if the earth there offered steadiness. Clara received another letter that spring, an offer, work east, near a growing town that wanted advice on building against cold. Good pay, a chance to start somewhere new, where no one knew her as the woman from the storm. She folded the letter and set it aside. That evening she walked the settlement alone, noting the changes that no longer startled her. The lowered roofs, the shared stores, the absence of bravado. She stopped near the edge, where the land dipped, and the snow had once swallowed houses whole. It looked ordinary now. That was the greatest victory winter ever allowed. She stayed, not out of obligation, not because she had become a symbol, but because the land had finally been listened to and she wanted to be there the next time it tried to speak. Years later, people would still talk about the blizzard of 1887, though fewer would remember the details clearly. The snow would grow deeper in the telling, the winds harsher, the losses greater, but one thing remained constant. They would point to the low, rounded structure near the bend and say, that's where the settlement survived. They would tell newcomers how it had been laughed at, how it had been dismissed as foolish, ugly, temporary, and how it had outlasted everything else, not because it was clever, but because it was honest about what the land demanded.